My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. On behalf of these, I want to welcome you out. Two quick announcements. One is if any of you happen to be here for a class, there'll be some sign-up sheets out in the lobby afterwards. But secondly, actually our guest this afternoon is also, right now, will also be speaking later this afternoon. We have a public symposium on the ethics of using fetal tissue in scientific research. That's at 4:15 in Q203. And our speaker now will also be there with another guest. We have Leslie Francis, who's coming in from University of Utah to speak on that topic. Also, a WSU professor, Terry Hassel. But now let me introduce our speaker for this our noontime event. Christopher Tollefsen is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. His research interests center around natural law ethics, philosophy of action, bioethics, and practical ethics. He is the author of dozens of articles in philosophical and ethics journals, and he's the co-author or author of at least 3 books: Lying in Christian Ethics, which was published last year by Cambridge University Press; Biomedical Research and Beyond, Expanding the Ethics of Inquiry, which was published by Routledge; and Embryo, Defense of Human Life, published by Doubleday. Chris is currently working on a book with Farr Curlin at Duke University on natural law and medical ethics. Join me now in welcoming Chris Tollefsen.
Super, thank you very much. This is a great opportunity for me in a way that I will explain to you. So what I'm going to do today hardly rises to the level of a paper. On Friday of last week, an editor of a journal sent me an essay that had been written by somebody critiquing an article of mine. He said, I thought you might like to take a look at this. And so on Monday morning, I took a look at it. I thought, wow, this is really good. This is really interesting. I need to think more about this. Problems. And then a little bit later on Monday morning, Richard emailed to ask if I was interested in doing something here, right now, the new talk. I thought, well, maybe I'll see what progress I can make on this problem. So I'm going to describe to you the context and the nature of the work that's being criticized, and then try and outline what I take to be the central criticism that's made. The article hasn't been published yet, so I won't mention any names. I'll call them Smith or Jones or something. But it will eventually come out, and it is a good article, I'm sorry to say. And then I'm going to try and just sketch a direction that I want to think more about. And if anybody has any thoughts about how that direction might be fleshed out, or why it's a bad direction, or what I'm overlooking, that would be great. So let me say just a little bit about the background for the paper in question. There's a widespread idea that there's a classical understanding of what the relationship between politics and morality is. And the thought is that the purpose of the state, the reason that we have political authority, is to lead human beings to all-round flourishing. And for the ancients, all-round flourishing included virtue. If you weren't a virtuous person, then you weren't a flourishing person. If you're not courageous, if you're not temperate, if you're not just, then you're really deficient as an instance of the species. And so part of the purpose of the state is to lead human beings, lead the citizens of the state to become all-around flourishing by way of being virtuous. And so the political state takes a direct interest in the moral quality of its citizens, even apart from other things that are brought about by having citizens that are of good moral quality. And you can imagine that there are such things. When you have morally upright citizens, things are going to go well for the polis, for the political community. H.L.A. Hart, the legal philosopher, said something, this is a really sketchy paraphrase, something to the effect that the moderns built lower to the ground. But he said their foundation was more secure. And I take it the thought is something like this. They didn't aspire to as significant a conception, as grandiose a conception of what the state was after. The state's aspirations were lowered. What it could do was thought to be more constrained, and hence the moderns had a more limited conception of the state and what the state could be empowered to do. It's called that contemporary idea contemporary classical liberalism. I think classical liberalism has a number of different aspects to it. I think some of them are very important. Central to the idea of classical liberalism is that citizens should think of one another and should treat one another as free, equal, and independent. And that idea, that central idea, generates a couple of different thoughts, two different thoughts that I want to distinguish as to how a state should respect its citizens. Right? One is embodied in John Stuart Mill's famous harm principle. Anybody read Mill's On Liberty or bits of On Liberty in classes? Mill says that the only purpose for which coercion is warranted is for self-protection, right? Is to prevent somebody from harming somebody else. Right? And so it's not warranted with regard to people's activities that only have bearing on themselves. And there's an argument to be made for the claim that this is one way of showing respect for fellow citizens, is not to coerce them if they're not harming somebody else. A second idea, different, is that in order to show that same respect, the same respect for our fellow citizens as free, equal, and independent, we need to be neutral. Right? We need to embody some form of neutrality with respect to citizens' different conceptions of the good. Right? They might be religious conceptions, but they might not be religious conceptions. They might be ethical conceptions, such as you would study in an ethical theory class, utilitarians, deontologists, people who think that autonomy is the single greatest and most important good. Or they could be natural law philosophers, such as the folks that I work with. We think that flourishing depends upon a right orientation to a number of what we call basic goods, goods that are constitutive aspects of human well-being, like friendship, or we think religion, or integrity. The neutralist says you need to abstract from those rich, substantive, deep conceptions of what's good in thinking about what laws to pass that will be coercive on others. Right? Because we can't get agreement on those, on laws based on these substantive conceptions. Right? And if we pass a law that's going to coerce somebody, right, where we can't get their agreement to be coerced with respect to this thing, then we fail to show respect. Does that make sense? Everybody with me? Okay, there's a lot more to be said about that. Natural law philosophers of the sort that I am, we call ourselves perfectionists, right, because we think that it's important for the state to have a robust conception of human flourishing in order to be able to pass good laws, right, and that robust conception of human flourishing is important because it allows human beings to be perfected as human beings. Right? So we share that with the ancient tradition. Right? Natural law philosophers are perfectionists, and hence they're not neutral. They don't accept the neutrality principle. And the question that I want to ask is whether natural law philosophers were perfectionists, right, who think that the state should work with a rich conception of what's genuinely good. Should we adopt Mill's harm principle, or should we reject that as well? And if you accept the ancient view, the classical view, what I described at the very beginning, then you should reject it. You should reject Mill's harm principle. If the purpose of the state is to lead us to all-round flourishing, and that includes virtue, then the state should take an interest in your virtue and your virtue and your virtue, right? Independently of what other effects it might have, independently of whether it would harm somebody else. What I argued in this particular paper under discussion, a paper called, I think it's called Pure Perfection and the Limits of Paternalism. What I argued is that perfectionists should accept Mill's harm principle. They should not accept the position that I call pure paternalism. Pure paternalism is the idea that the state can take an interest in your activity simply because, right, independently of other effects that it might have, but simply because of the effects on your moral character that activity might have. And we could identify a handful of different, and this is from the paper that I was sent, but it's a good list. Some of these clearly do cause harm to other people, but the harm is consensual, so that's taken to be acceptable within the framework of Mill's harm principle. Consensual gladiatorial contests, the bar sport of dwarf tossing, elective amputations, cannibalism, prostitution, pornography, methamphetamine and cocaine use. You could imagine various other things that we could do that would be degrading of our character, but that don't cause non-consensual harm to other people. Right? I think there's a pretty good case to be made that if you are engaged in, for instance, dwarf tossing, right, on any side of that transaction, right, even if it's done entirely consensually, right, you're probably engaged in something that's degrading to your character, right, and probably not establishing the kind of character that will dispose you towards sound relationships with other human beings. Right? You show yourself willing to treat some human beings as objects in this particular case. The question is, can the state take an interest in these activities simply for the sake of the moral character of their citizens, of its citizens? The way that I try to go about answering this is going to raise then the objection that's raised. The way that I try to go about answering this is to ask, well, why do we need political authority in the first place? What is the argument for having political authority at all? If we can get that argument, then that argument might tell us something about the limits of that authority. By understanding its purposes, we might understand something about how its power, the power or the nature of that authority is to be constrained or should be thought of as constrained. And from the natural law standpoint that I operate in, right, where the most fundamental question I think that we start with as practical agents is, what does it mean to be flourishing as a human being? Right? We can ask ourselves that question, what do we need in order to flourish? And we can recognize that as individuals, all of us are radically non-self-sufficient with regard to what we need in order to flourish, in order to be well off as human beings, to live good lives. Okay, everybody has an understanding, some understanding probably differs for all of us from person to person in some ways, some maybe ways that some of us might disagree with, but also ways that are, I think, entirely acceptable. We have different conceptions of what it would mean for us to flourish, for us to be well off, for us to be happy, in some sense. Okay. But we should all recognize that none of us individually is sufficient for bringing about that flourishing. Right? How many people here, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I assume everybody here has friends, right? Is that, everybody good? Right? Talk to me after if you need to, right? Is that good for you? Is that part of your flourishing? It is, right? You're better off as a human being for having friends, right? Some of the goods that are essential to us as human beings require other people in order for us to be able to realize those goods at all. Okay. Not only that, I mean, how many people have ever been to a doctor? Right? Everybody, probably. Some of the goods, even if they don't intrinsically bring in other persons into their nature the way that friendship does, right, are clearly better pursued communally, socially, and not just socially right here and now, but if you think about the way that medicine works, or the way that other intellectual inquiry works, right, through time. Doctors have been amassing a body of knowledge and practice that they pass on to one another generation by generation and improve together generation by generation. And that benefits all of us in ways that would be greatly to our loss if every doctor was to think of him or herself as completely self-sufficient. Right? And, I mean, at least we'd get rid of medical schools, right? So you could become a doctor pretty cheap. All you'd have to do is say, I'm a doctor, and you'd be all set. But the rest of us would probably suffer as a result. Okay? So we're not self-sufficient with regard to our flourishing. And so it makes sense for us to engage with other human beings, cooperate with other human beings, form social groups with other human beings, as everybody here right now is doing, for instance. Right? We're all engaged in a kind of common intellectual project right here and now, of trying to figure something out, right? Maybe talk through some aspects of it, engage in some mutual criticism, and then we'll probably go away and think about what's been said. And then if things are going well, right, some of us will get back together again and say, hey, remember when Tollefson said that really stupid thing? Here's what I think about that. And then somebody said, no, that was the best thing that Tollefson said. little argument. Okay? And your intellectual life will be enhanced, it seems to me, through this. So we're not self-sufficient. We form these groups. We form a variety of different societies. You can think about how extensive the forming of societies is in order to make flourishing possible for us. We form families. We form groups of friends. We form churches. We form various institutions that make possible the pursuit of the goods of human life, such as hospitals and medical schools, institutions that make possible the pursuit of knowledge, such as universities, institutions that make possible the pursuit of play, such as various athletic institutions that make it possible for people both to engage in play and to enjoy other people's play. Right? We can see this across a wide variety of human goods that our lives are deeply social. Okay? We're not self-sufficient. To many people, if you stop right there, that sounds pretty attractive. right? Now you have a kind of picture of various overlapping societies. Right? We could call it a society of overlapping societies, where you're in your families, and you've got your church group, and other people have their church group, and you've got your university, and other people have their university, and maybe some organizations dedicated to charitable works. Right? We see a variety of those in different places, and different people are pursuing different purposes with people that they've come together with in order to pursue those purposes with. Right? It's a very attractive picture of society. And if that society was itself self-sufficient, it seems like we would have no need for political authority. Right? Why would we need to have somebody telling us this is how to do things, right, if things are going okay in that society of overlapping societies? And the answer, I think, is that society of overlapping societies is itself not self-sufficient. And it's not self-sufficient in four ways. Right? That is to say, all these different groups operating, doing their own thing, sometimes cooperating with other groups, right, but sometimes not. They have four needs that they're incapable of fulfilling together in the absence of what I'll call political authority. What are those four needs? Well, they need to have somebody who can coordinate their mutual lives such that they don't interfere with one another, right? And such that they're all following pretty much the same template as to what they take themselves to be allowed to do and not do, so that they don't take things from one another and sort of run into each other when they're operating their respective groups. Okay? They need to be able to protect themselves from external hostile forces. Right? You've got a bunch of people doing things really well, and they start to amass resources, and they have various positive things going on in their life. This is going to inspire people outside the community of overlapping communities to come and try and take that away. That's the problem that Plato points to in the Republic. But if we don't have somebody coordinating the response to that, then it's not going to be effective. Right? If I say, all families to the front so that we can protect our society of overlapping societies, all the other families have a reason to say, no, it'd be better for Tollefson to do that, and I'll just stay home, right? But if Tollefson does it by himself and everybody else stays home, no good. Okay? You need to have somebody who has the authority to make everybody who needs to be there protecting everybody to actually do that. Similarly, right, if Bill, Professor Cavasenche to some of you, does something horrible to me, right? If he takes my iPad, unlikely, documented anti-technological attitudes. If he takes my iPad, what am I going to do, right? I could beat him up, but maybe he took it by accident. I don't seem like I'm in a position to be able to make a good judgment as to whether he should be punished, or even to have the status to punish him. And I can't really make anybody else do it. We need to have some impersonal authority, right, whose job it is, among other things, to protect against internal wrongdoers and to punish when necessary. And then finally, right, all those various groups, especially families, but not exclusively families, church groups, hospitals, charitable organizations, they're all taking care of people. They all have obligations to people, and they care for people when those people that are their dependents need care. Right? Is everybody going to be cared for in such a circumstance? Unfortunately, not. There are going to be some people, for instance, that we just don't know who should be caring for these people. Right? They fall through the cracks. They're orphans, for instance. And then, of course, some people are going to default on their obligations, and they're not going to care for people in the appropriate way. And so we need something with authority to make it possible that people who are extremely dependent and vulnerable, who are not going to get the care that they need, are going to get the care that they need. Now, if this was a different talk, right, all that would be leveraged for making an argument against a particular form of extreme libertarianism, for instance, a particular form of political libertarianism. Those are all the reasons that I think we do need political authority, and they include, for instance, the need to provide certain kinds of welfare rights to people. But in this context, I want to raise a different question. How does that discussion tell us something about the limits of state authority? Well, in the paper that I wrote about this topic, what I suggested is that we should think about the state as a kind of instrument, a kind of tool. Right? And we now have four purposes for which this tool is needed. Right? The purposes of coordination of the various groups of overlapping societies, the purpose of protection against external invaders, the purpose of protection against internal hostilities and damage, and the purpose of providing welfare to people who otherwise won't have it provided to them. Right? That's the purpose of, those are the four purposes of the state. The state is a tool, an instrumentality, to make it possible for us to satisfy those four, what I call political needs of flourishing. Okay? And in a separate part of the paper that I won't talk much about, I say a little bit as well about subsequent needs that we have, and I think this is just an interesting point to mention. Right? Subsequent needs that we have, that political authority also be exercised in a way that's respectful of certain properties that we have, our freedom, our independence, and our equality, for instance. And this gives rise to what we could call needs for citizenship, right, that look very much like the requirements of liberal democracy. Right? We want people to be able to have a say, for instance, in how authority is exercised. And so we think voting is a good thing. We want the institutions that make that authority, that the exercise of that authority possible, to be transparent and to be operated in accordance with the impersonal norms of law rather than the whim, right, of whoever happens to have political authority. So I think we get to something very close to the liberal democratic ideal of politics by way of this conception. Right? But the thought is, as I articulated it, I'm leaving one thing out that I'll get to. Here are the purposes of the state, and the purposes of the state delineate the limits of the state's authority. The state has authority precisely in those domains in which individuals and groups are not self-sufficient. Right? Individuals need to have groups, right? But the groups also need something else. They need political authority. And it's where those individuals and groups are no longer self-sufficient that we need the state. That constitutes the boundaries of the state's authority. But if you look at a domain in which people are self-sufficient, namely the domain of human choice, where you are choosing to do something that affects no one else, right, or no one else without their consent, but is wrong, right, and character stultifying and degrading, it is still nevertheless the case that you are self-sufficient to be able to change and make a different choice and do something that's not self-stultifying, degrading, immoral. Right? If you are the person who is, this is an example from my paper, in your basement, right, making pornography for your own consumption or the consumption of your closest friends, right? And let's say, so that we get widespread agreement, right, it's really pretty disgusting pornography, but it's all done with a computer, right? So no other human beings are involved in its making. Still clearly degrading for you. Right? It makes you worse off as a person. But you are self-sufficient to be able to say no to that. Right? You have within you the capacity to say, no, I'm no longer going to do this. I recognize that it's degrading for me, and so I'm going to do something else. And that makes that kind of choice, right, the choice not to do what's degrading, right, something for which you're self-sufficient, and hence something for which the state does not have authority. Okay? That's the basic idea of the paper. Well, what time did we, how are we doing on?
You're fine. It's 12:24. Yeah, we got about half an hour still.
So here then is the response from my interlocutor. The basic picture, as I present it, is that you have a tool, okay, and the tool comes into existence for a set of purposes, right? And that set of purposes then constrains, right, the legitimate uses of the tool. Now, if you think about the picture at that level of generality, right, if you think simply, well, we've got a tool and the tool exists for certain purposes, then it looks like that doesn't get you what I want. So what I want is a set of principled limitations on state authority. Right? Not just pragmatic or prudential. Right? Not just, well, it would be, things could go badly if we did it this way, or there'd be problems if we did it that way. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a second. I describe the limits on state authority as principled. Right? Whether that means that they can never be violated, I think is an interesting question, and maybe we'll talk about that later. Right? But it can't just be rooted in situational factors. Right? There's something about the nature of political authority that intrinsically limits it. And that would be a funny thing to think. I think my interlocutor is correct about this. It would be a funny thing to think about tools generally. Right? So to use his example, suppose that you've got a hammer. A hammer comes into existence for a particular purpose. Right? And the purpose is, he has a very elegant way of talking about it that I'm not going to be able to replicate taking detached objects and attaching them with nails, right? I take it that's why we have hammers. But it would be a strange argument to say, well, hammers come into existence for this particular purpose, and that purpose therefore constrains what we might think of as the authority of the hammer, right? So that the hammer can't be used to do other things that were not among its initial purposes. And so the example that he uses is putting thumbtacks in, right? I could do thumbtacks perfect. I'm self-sufficient. My thumb is perfectly self-sufficient to put thumbtacks in something. Right? And the hammer came into existence for a different purpose, something that my thumb is not self-sufficient for, attaching detached objects with a nail. So it looks like my argument would suggest that you couldn't use a hammer to put in the thumbtacks. Everybody see how right? And I think if you think generally about the structure of this objection, it certainly seems sound, right? There's all kinds of things that we use tools for that are not the purposes for which those tools came into existence, right? Often not even imagined by the people who created those tools, right? And in fact, I've argued, and this is now ages and ages ago, that really you can take a tool and use it for a new purpose, and it just becomes a new tool, right? That's how easy tool construction is. Right, the first person who picks up a stick, right, and sticks something with it, an animal, right, has created a spear. You don't even have to do something with the stick in order to, you don't have to, fix it in order for it to be a tool, right? But then somebody can take that same piece of wood and use it to make a tent, or they can use it to cook some meat, or they can use, et cetera, et cetera. There doesn't seem to be any natural constraint on using tools. Well, what could the problem be? My interlocutor suggests there might be two possible problems. Right? It might be the case that if you use the tool for a purpose for which it was not created, then it's going to make things worse than it otherwise would in some respect. Right? So if I start using the hammer for the thumbtacks, he says it might weaken my thumb. Right? And in the same way, if we start using the state to enforce moral norms, independently of whether the violation of those norms causes harm, right? It might weaken our moral resolve, right? We might become too dependent upon the state for ourselves to be upright, morally good persons. The other objection that he says is there might be opportunity costs, right? If I'm too busy using the hammer over here, right, then there are nails that are not getting nailed, right, that I should actually be using the hammer for. And similarly, if we're too busy using the state as a coercive mechanism to try and make people morally better, other important purposes of the state might be going unsatisfied. The problem is that both of those don't look like principled objections. They look like prudential or practical objections, right? They depend upon circumstances. In each case, you might say, sometimes that might be the case, and sometimes it might not be the case. Right? So it doesn't look like it rises to the level of a principled limit on the state, even if you were to accept either of those two options. Does that make sense so far? Everybody with me? Okay, so that was the quick part of the talk, and now we're at the sketchy part of the talk. Right? So what is it that I can say in response to this? I want to look at a quotation from my original paper, which I marked somewhere. Hopefully you'll find it. It's quoted by this fellow in his writing. But I want to suggest that in it is the idea that we need. So just give me 1 second while I scroll through this and find this. Okay, so here's the sort of argument from the paper as I lay it out at a particular point. I say, but an instrument is a means to some end not otherwise attainable or easily attainable. We need a hammer in order to join otherwise detached objects with nails. So if the state is an instrument, it addresses some need, some purpose that would otherwise not be attainable. It would address, in other words, some respect in which persons were insufficient for their own flourishing. But as regards their choices, persons are self-sufficient. They have sovereignty over their choices, right or wrong, that does not require the assistance of the state just as such. But of course, individuals are not self-sufficient as regards the choices other agents make. So while it oversteps the limits of the state to coerce a citizen's choices for his own sake, it does not overstep the limits in coercing such choices for the sake of another. Here's an example Right? I think lying is bad for me. Right? If I lie to you, right, that's degrading to me in some way. Right? It makes me a worse person. It's not conducive to my human flourishing. But I am self-sufficient with regard to whether I'm going to lie or not. I can choose not to lie. But if I'm selling you a car and I'm lying to you about it, right, there are going to be all sorts of circumstances in which you're not in a position to be self-sufficient with regard to the truth. Right? You're depending upon my word. And so it makes sense for the state to prevent my lying to you about the car that I'm selling you. Right? Not because it's bad for me to be lying, but because it's bad for you and you're not self-sufficient with regard to being able to take care of that badness, right? To prevent that badness. And hence you get something like Mill's principle, right? The harm principle. You can only coerce for the sake of protection. In this passage that I just read, it seems to me that there's one word that's important and that I want to sort of stake my ground at, and I think has to be central to the resolution of this. And it is in the following very brief passage. As regards their choices, persons are self-sufficient. They have sovereignty over their choices, right or wrong, but does not require the assistance of the state as such. This notion of sovereignty seems to me important. When we talk about authority, right, we use this word authority very loosely and almost humorously about a hammer, right? Does the hammer have authority with regard to its nails, or authority with regard to thumbnails, or whatever the thumb things are? It's a kind of deeply metaphorical way of talking about the hammer. What is authority? Authority is when somebody gives you reasons for doing something. And because that person has authority, the reasons that you previously had for doing something are excluded now. Maybe not in every possible case. Somebody in authority can give you, right, a bad order. But to the extent authority is working as it should, right, authoritative demands don't just get added into the various reasons that you have for and against something. Right? They put those reasons aside. Right? You might have independently been thinking, well, I could do this or I could do that. Once the authority speaks, right, those reasons are put aside, and the authority, right, acting as an authority, has given you the exclusive reason on which you're going to act. So you might think to yourself, well, there's pretty good reasons for wearing a helmet when I'm riding my motorcycle, and there's pretty good reasons for not wearing a helmet when I'm riding my motorcycle. And you might be thinking, well, where does the balance come down? But once the law says helmet when you're on a motorcycle, right, then you put your balancing aside and you follow the law. Okay? It seems to me that if we have sovereignty over our choices, right, if there's something right to that description, we're sovereign with respect to our choices. We're giving up that sovereignty, right, when we allow some other individual or institution to have authority. Right? It's giving away what is naturally ours in some sense. Okay? And it's giving it away with respect to something that is constitutive, right, deep at the heart of morality. If morality is about pursuing self-fulfillment individually and with others, right, pursuing human fulfillment individually and with others, right, it can only be done by us making choices, right? You can't be made a good person by somebody else. It can only come about through your good choices, right? So making choices is at the heart of morality, right? That's why you have sovereignty over those choices, and that suggests that you can only give up that sovereignty for good reason, and that when you give up that sovereignty, as for instance to the authority of the state, the giving up of your sovereignty only tracks the reasons for which you've given it up. Now, what are those reasons I gave for it, right? Those reasons just are the four purposes for which we need political authority, right? Those are four good reasons for me to give up the sovereignty that I have over my individual choice. But in the absence of those reasons, then it seems to me an overreach on the part of anybody, right, political authority or otherwise, right, to assert more authority than they have reason for taking from me, given the sovereignty that I have. And so it seems to me that, and we can bring this all back to Mill's harm principle, right? My paper was a defense of Mill's harm principle. The state has no authority over those acts that only affect you, because you are sovereign over those acts, right? You're self-sufficient with regard to them. And because you're sovereign over them, the state can't take that sovereignty with you except by injustice, right? And so the state really should only act to protect other people from your bad actions. and shouldn't get involved in what you're doing insofar as it only affects yourself, even when that effect that it has on you is morally quite bad and corrupting. Okay, so that's the basic idea there. And I know it was fast and at times sketchy, so I'm happy to flesh things out, to take objections, or to take people's thoughts on this idea of the sovereignty that we have over our own choices and the conditions under which that sovereignty can be alienated, I guess is one way to put the question. Right? Can it be alienated without these four purposes that I've identified?
Okay, so we've got about 15, 20 minutes for Q&A. Let me start with a quick question. You did lose me, but you went a different direction than I expected. You're starting to talk about something in this overlapping consensus of comprehensive conceptions of good life, which is sort of the Rawlsian argument about how you would create a political community of pluralism like we have. But then rather than defending the Rawlsian principle of liberty, which is maximum liberty based upon equal sharing of liberty, you then move to Mill's principle of harm, which raises all sorts of other, I think, interesting questions and problems. Why?
So there's a couple of reasons. I think Mill's principle is, in one way, much less restrictive than the Rawlsian conception, than the neutralist conception. Right? The Mill principle is completely compatible. Now you have to have, what do you have to do in order to apply Mill's principle? You have to have an understanding of what it means to harm somebody. Right? And I think that's important. Right? And that...
Which is grounded in a particular conception of the good life.
That's right. That's exactly right. You need to have the kind of argument that I think that we need to have, both morally and politically, in order to be able to understand what it means to harm somebody. You need to talk about what are the goods that are essential to human well-being, such that if we damage them in some way, then human beings are harmed. So Mill's conception, seems to me, is compatible with what I'm calling a natural law or perfectionist account of morality and politics, where the purpose of the state, right? If you think about why do we need that political authority? It's ultimately to make it possible for individuals and groups to flourish, right? And that can only be done if they have an adequate conception of what their good is. The adherence to the principle of neutrality, whether Rawls or Dworkin or a variety of other characters, they reject exactly that kind of substantive deliberation about the nature of the human good. And so that's why the neutralist principle seems to me much more restrictive, much stronger than the harm principle, incompatible with a natural law perfectionist account, and also not terribly persuasive on its own terms. So central to the neutralist objection to paternalism is the thought that I disrespect you in trying to coerce you from doing something that's manifestly bad for you. I don't think that's a very persuasive objection. I can try and coerce you from doing something that's bad for you precisely because I know that it's bad for you. Right? That's a good reason for parents to get involved in their children's lives, for teachers to get involved sometimes in their students' problems, for friends to get involved in their lives. But it doesn't seem to me just as such that it's a good reason for the state to get involved in citizens' lives. An important part of the tradition, to the contrary, notwithstanding.
Once we agree on the harm.
Yeah. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I'm intrigued with your use of the word perfect, because that seems to me a big problem. What I have is perfect, and I want you to have the same perfection that I have. In other words, it seems very subjective, and it's also it's defining of behavior that's impossible.
Yeah, so I think I agree that there are some problems with the language of perfectionism, which is in part taken from Rawls, so it kind of owes something to the way that it's initially characterized by Rawls in the theory of justice. But it does come with it, for me, it does come with a commitment to the idea that there are better and worse ways for human beings to live their lives. Now, I don't think, and Rawls seems in fact to think, that if you're a perfectionist that means that there's one best way for people to live this. It's manifestly false, right? I think there's many different goods, and within the many goods that are important to us as human beings, there are many, many, many different forms of human life that are good for human beings. Right? But there are also, it seems to me, ways of life that are not good, that are deficient if you think about what it is that's important for us to flourish as human beings. Lives that are too deeply self-centered and unconcerned with other human beings. Right? It seemed to me not to realize the important good of sociality that is essential to us being well off. And so the idea of perfectionism, it has maybe more of the objectivity than you want it to have, but that is also compatible, it seems to me, with deep plurality that's sometimes overlooked when we think about the sort of classical perfectionist natural law tradition. We think that meant that everybody had to lead the same life. I think that's false.
Yeah.
You had a question? Yes.
Yeah. I was wondering, what about a situation where an individual's actions had an indirect negative impact on the rest of society? Is that a situation where the state would be responsible?
Yeah, so that's good. That's an that's a very helpful question. There are really two kinds of ways, very broadly construed, that your action can negatively bear upon other people. It can be direct, right? You want my iPad very badly, so you assault me after the talk in order to take it. But it can be indirect in a variety of different ways, some of which are clearly not morally problematic, right? I mean, suppose that you really could be a great doctor, but you could also be a great musician. And so you decide to become a great musician, and that means that a bunch of people are not going to be healed, maybe, because you're not doing that. In some sense, is that a harm? In some sense, maybe it is. That doesn't seem sufficient for making it the case that the state should say, no, right, you shouldn't do that, you should do this other thing. We need a reason for why that's not the sort of thing that the state should get involved in. I think there is a reason. I think that it's fundamentally fair to allow people to make these decisions over their lives where there are indirect consequences for other people. But you can contrast that with other cases where people are negligent, right? They're polluting a river, not because they want to poison the people downstream, but just because they want to make more money, and they just don't care about what's happening downstream. That's a pretty good reason. I mean, that seems to be obviously unfair, and the kind of harm that might be done there seems like a good enough reason for the state to get involved in. So it seems to me that if the harm is serious, where it's direct, right, if you're deliberately trying to do damage against some other human being or their goods, steal their property, take their life, very often the state has a very good reason for getting involved. And with the indirect sorts of harms, we need to be more careful about that. It's a harder question. It's not an automatic that just because there might be some negative side effect, the state can get involved. Is that it? Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I wanted to know what are the underlying characteristics of humanity that define what makes up human good or bad? For that instance?
That's a nice question. So it tracks a sort of traditional way of thinking about the natural law, which is that you look at human nature and that you infer from human nature what human beings are perfective of human nature. And I actually think that, and there's a much longer story behind this that we don't need to get into, but I think the procedure works the other way. Right? We come to understand our nature by understanding the sorts of things that are good for us, that are perfective of us, that are aspects of our well-being, and understanding that other things are not. Right? So when we come to, if you look at a child, very young child, always they start very early. They're smiling at their parents, and they're trying to touch their parents, and there's clearly some sort of relationality. And at a certain point, a child sort of starts to have a recognition that this is something that they want to do, and it becomes more deliberate. And sometimes they are then faced with choices: do I do this thing that I want, or do I do this thing that mom wants? And that sort of develops through time. They come to recognize friendship with their parent as something that's important to them, something that's good for them, something that makes them better off. Right? And in coming to that awareness, they're coming to know something about their own nature. I think it's actually pretty silly to think of small children, right, doing all these things. They have these natural relationships with their parents of touching and smiling and so on. Sort of looking at those things and thinking, oh, so this must be my nature. I bet that means that it's good for me. I don't think that's the direction that it goes. Right? It seems to me they recognize that this is good, and that in doing so, they come to understand. They have insight into their nature. Like I said, that's a vexed claim among natural law philosophers, generally speaking. Right? But it seems to be plausible. Yes. And then I know there's quite. I'll get you. Yes, go ahead.
So, if I'm comprehending everything correctly, we seek out groups in order to kind of fulfill. We need groups in order to flourish. So, if the authority itself is a group, what is to stop the authority from acting in its own group self-interest against the rest of the society?
So, I think that's a very good question. when people get together as a group, it's for some particular purpose or other. Now, the purpose could even just be the purpose of friendship, right? Where the other things you do are in order to serve the kind of friendship, but very often it's some other purpose. Right? And in a way, your question, I think, is helpful for articulating what I'm trying to say. When the group that is the political state gets together, right, what is its purpose? Well, it has these four purposes. And if you think about other groups, maybe the analogy is going to be strained, right? But you and your friends get together to do, to study, right? And so you have a study group, or you and your friends get together to play some sport, and so you have that particular sport group, or to do any of a variety of different other things. And even in those, you very frequently require some kind of authority, right? Somebody's going to say, we're going to meet at this time, right? Or we're going to, meet there and not there, or we're going to do this, not that. If those forms of authority start taking other purposes to be central to their exercise of authority and what they say that your group can and can't do, then they seem to be stepping outside the boundaries that brought the group together and that created the group in the first place, right? And so if your rugby group, the captain of your rugby team starts saying, we're all going to go to church at this place, or, right, if somebody from your church says, we're all going to play rugby, right, no more soccer, then they seem to be exceeding their authority in ways that are related to the constitution of the group itself. And so while what you're describing can happen, right, political authority can act beyond its authority, that authority should be understood as constructed on the basis of what that group came about in order to achieve, right, what their common end is, what their common good is. And that common good is the satisfaction of these four purposes that I identified. Is that, you see what I'm saying? Now, and right there is where this objection that this guy, it seems to me, is both making and needs to be answered. Yes.
Okay. It seems like you have this principle, something like you ought not use political authority for things for which we're self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And allow me to strain the metaphor of the hammer just a bit. So imagine I'm terrified of spiders, but I've noticed that hammers can kill spiders. So it's something that maybe I can't do myself because I can't get close enough to it without the hammer. So I'm kind of wondering, I don't know much about natural law and political philosophy, but I'm kind of wondering, what is the achievable sort of attainable utopia toward which you're aiming in this regard? So, that's one of the things that, hey, what's our target? Are we just saying whatever's attainable is attainable, done and done? Or is there some sort of target? And the reason I'm wondering about this is it seems like there is this tool that can help some people that perhaps are not sufficient in certain ways, in sort of we talked about virtue. Virtue typically is understood as a disposition to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason. Why can't we use sort of a paternalistic approach with this political authority to enact some sort of moral habituation? Because it does seem like more virtuous citizens is overall better, and that seems like that's probably a better target than a target just to be able to deal with these other issues, not this wonderful thing that we think is good.
Sure. So that's helpful. I would characterize it as a utopia because I don't think utopias are helpful. But what I would think of as a very good state of affairs is one in which you do have a variety of different small social groups, some actually relatively big, some very small like the family, and you have a state that is making it possible for all of those institutions, groups, associations to do what they do best. And it seems to me that there's independent reason of what I've said here, and your question is very helpful because I realize I need to put these two things together. There's independent reason for thinking that habituation to virtue is going to be done best primarily at these much more local levels, right? The level of families raising children, for instance, and schools taking care of those children and continuing to provide habituation into virtue. and is often, I mean, this is an independent, this is, I think, maybe a more prudential concern. It's going to be done, in a pretty rough and often unsatisfactory way if it's done by the state, if it's done properly at all. Right? And there are questions of pluralism. Why we would think that, I mean, I think even if you take a pretty robust conception of virtues and think there's an objective set of virtues, might not be the case that they're all equally instantiable in all persons. Right? It might be that they come in clusters for different people. And is the state really going to be in a position to be able to determine which cluster is your cluster? No. And then, what's the alternative? Well, deciding on one particular cluster and making it normative for everybody. I think those are all problems. In a way, I think that does tie back to my principled thought, because it leads us back to why we should think that we are sovereign over our choices, both individually and in these smaller groups. One of the reasons that we're sovereign is because we're better. Right? That's the domain in which we're most successful at making choices in an upright way. We need help, right? The state does provide that help. And there can be side effect modeling from the things that the state does. The laws shouldn't encourage certain kinds of vices, even if they're not prohibiting them. That can be helpful for parents, certainly. But I think at the end of the day, the work that you're describing is best done at much more local levels. But I think there's more for me to think about there. That's very helpful. Yes, sir.
Well, given your theory and approach, do you support the state requiring wearing motorcycle helmets?
Yeah.
I mean,
No, it's right. I mean, yes, I do. And the short answer is for the kids. Right. That's a line from a Coen Brothers movie that nobody has seen, but involving a hula hoop. Why have such laws? Right. Why have laws that are paternalistic in the sense that I find problematic? Although not in this case morally paternalistic, right? They're not making people wear helmets because it's morally corruptive. It's because they're worried they're going to get killed, and the social costs of that are going to be pretty significant, right? If you've got young dads or moms out there riding motorcycles without helmets, then the cost of having them get into accidents is going to be much more significant, at least in theory, than if you require them to wear helmets. It seems to me that even that kind of, there is a form of paternalism, right? But it's actually less paternalistic than it seems. You're not primarily about preventing them from doing harm to themselves. You're concerned about the harm that's going to be done more broadly, and that seems to be true about, where exactly to draw the line with regard to drug use, for instance, or drug abuse. I'm not exactly sure where it is. It might need to be, somewhat more permissive than it is right now, or somewhat less permissive. But to a great extent, the justification for laws restricting drug use don't have to do with the harm that I would be doing myself, whether morally or physically, by taking drugs, but with the inevitable bad effects that would accrue to my children, my friends, my colleagues, et cetera, and all the rest of society. Now, an objection that you might raise is say, well then, doesn't every bad behavior have pretty extensive bad social effects? I think the answer is yes. So at the end of the day, there's not huge difference between the two views, but I think there is some difference, nevertheless.
So could you give us an example of a regulation or law or whatever that you disagree with?
Almost anything that would be, so I think place matters, right? So if something is done in your home, right, and doesn't involve commerce outside the home, then there's no business that the law has restricting it, right? And so there were, the anti-sodomy laws that were overturned by the Supreme Court, but initially upheld by the Supreme Court. When they were overturned, Clarence Thomas, who didn't vote to overturn them, nevertheless said, these are bad laws, right? His disagreement was with who had the authority to overturn them, right? Laws that regulate what you're doing in your bedroom, whether sexual laws or laws having to do with pornography or probably even drug use, I think are probably not. So they get ruled out. Yeah.
So I latched on very closely to your analogy with the person selling the car and the responsibility of self-sufficiency of determining the truth or lying in that situation, and having the government is kind of a mediating force to ensure that the person buying the car, who is not self-sufficient to discern the truth in that scenario, has some guarantees to protections in that scenario. But what if in that scenario one of those two parties is actually the government? The example that I was thinking of most strongly was the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where the public writ large did not have kind of a self-sufficient guarantee to the truth of exactly what was present and what was not. And I feel that the invasion of Iraq and the ensuing war that took place in that particular country was a violation of Mill's harm principle in that case. So, but I would also say that the government's reasoning for going in there was the second of the two principles that you laid out, in that they claimed that this was a protection of the community of shared communities against an outside force. So where would you feel is the balance between the people and their government, when people feel that their government has been lying to them and has created a harmful outcome, even if they claim from the outset that it was for a good purpose? Where is the balance there?
So I distinguish very quickly, right, between the political needs for flourishing that generate a need for political authority, and then what I call needs for citizenship. We can think, wow, now we have this thing called political authority, and political authority inevitably has considerable power, has to if it's going to work, right? Because people don't always follow the authority, and so there need to be consequences after that, and then there have to be, that's going to then bring all kinds of other things, bureaucracy and the like in training. That, it seems to me, puts us as citizens into an odd place. It's kind of strange. It doesn't seem a perfect fit with our nature as self-constituting beings, as free, equal, and independent, to be under authority. And so, to the extent that it's possible, we want to move away from a paradigm of personal authority, the authority of the ruler over us, to the impersonal authority of law, and to models of governance that include shared governance, right? Where you take, in Aristotle's language, you take turns, ruling and being ruled. Moving into that model, you can then still be struck with basic facts about human nature, right? There will still be lying, there will still be mendacity, there will still be taking advantage of the situation in order to pursue other ends. And so you have ideas about checks and balances and distributed power and other extra political institutions such as a free press whose job it is to, right? And then, this is another way in which you get to a picture of a thriving civil society. Is that civil society going to be perfect in maintaining the boundaries and checking against abuse of power? Certainly not, right? But that's how I think we get to the idea of what that society should look like, is by considering these sorts of bad outcomes and asking what institutionally could we do, what societally could we do that would provide at least some hedge against that.
Unfortunately, time is up. Let me just remind you, if you're here for a class, there's some sign-up sheets out in the lobby. Also, if you'd like to hear more from Christopher Tollefson this evening at 4:15 in Q203, we'll be holding a symposium on the ethics of using fetal tissue in scientific research. Join me now, and thank you to Christopher Tollefson for an interesting presentation.